what drew you into the field of working with neuromodulation technology and the school that you run, and maybe just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, let me start by saying how I got into the field, which is kind of a story in and of itself. So I was working in the field of wind energy, renewable energy development, and that was my career. And I'd happened to get a master's degree following my first master's. I got another one in psychology, counseling psychology, and I thought, I'm not going to use this. In fact, I announced to my class, I'm not going to be a therapist. I don't think I can sit and talk to people all day. And long story short, I ended up in Hawaii. I was told by a Vedic astrologer that my entire life would change on May 17th, 2011. He said, you're going to be exiting a malefic period called Rahu, and you're going to have your whole life change. And I was in a bit of a funk. I had gone through a breakup. I really didn't feel connected to my career. And I said, well, I'm going to go to Hawaii and make the most of this date, So I did, and spent the week there intending sort of what I was here to do on this planet. And I'd happened to buy a Groupon, which is an online deal for something called Brain Fitness Hawaii. And I thought, oh, this is going to be kind of fun and silly. And so the date approached, and nothing had changed, nothing miraculous had happened. And I actually hadn't even thought that this Brain Fitness Hawaii thing might be anything of relevance. So I went in, and this woman named Dr. Hannah Yin came, and she approached me, and she gave me a book, a little menu, and she said, choose 5 things that you'd like to have in life. And so from that, I chose my 5 things, and the only one I remember is spiritual, ascension or whatever. And so from that menu, she decided where to put electrodes on my head. And she put electrodes on my head, and she put me in front of a mandala that grew and shrunk. Now, I know it was Bill Scott's brain paint, but at the time I didn't know what it was. And she said, your objective is to make this mandala big and beautiful. And then the next thing was a green bar that said what is, and a red bar that said what isn't. And I had to make the green bar big. And I was so enthralled by that experience. I mean, it was sort of like this very clear message from God. I could even tell you what I was wearing. I could tell you what the parking lot looked like after I stepped out of the room. And I came back to Santa Barbara, and I contacted everybody I could find who did this thing called neurofeedback. And in a short matter of time, I quit my job, which was a very well-paying job and a big piece of my ego. And I went to work for a psychologist as an intern in a little hole in the wall, relinquishing all of my everything, my laptop, my credit card, my BlackBerry, and I remember dusting off this old rickety Dell laptop from graduate school thinking, what have I done to my life? I've absolutely bombed myself. I'm back to, ground zero. And I opened it up, and this scrolling marquee flashed on the screen, and it said, there's nothing that you cannot do, be, or have. There's a huge metaphysical staff here to assist you. And that was sort of like okay, I guess that I'm on the right path here. I'm supposed to do this thing. And so, I ended up learning old school neurofeedback, lots of different modalities, and it just sort of carried on. And I earned my stripes in the field, working with different people and having different experiences with partnerships pursued and partnerships failed. And anyway, and now at this point, I am where I am. But it's a pleasure, and I am so grateful that I decided to jump across this crevasse, and transfer careers, and it really worked out lovely. I met my husband, and I have a family because I moved over into this field, and it's really my heart. So, yeah. And then the second question you asked.
Well, actually, I was thinking, listening to what you said, you shared your first experience as a client, really, because you didn't know what the mechanism was at that time, why the mandala was changing.
Right.
So, and as clients, we don't know the technology, so we can often have quite a emotional or spiritual or quite a transformative experience with this stuff. If you think back to what was happening with that technology, now, all these years later, what do you think was going on for you?
Yeah,
What do you think was actually going on at a brain level?
such a good question. Yeah, I think that it was a very spiritual experience. This notion of what is and what isn't, and affirming reality, and you know, creating from the field of pure potentiality your future. Right, that was sort of my take on what was happening in the moment. Right, sort of like, oh my goodness, the amount of agency and power in that process. Right, yeah. So it was figurative, right? It was symbolic of
Right.
creative potential.
And wonderful.
Yeah.
Telling us a little bit about what you do with this, all these years later, what you do with the school. It
Sure.
might mean some other history being filled in there too.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The school is a relatively newer pursuit, although the concept has been in utero for about 5 years total. Well, I shouldn't say it's been in utero. It was in utero for a few years. Came into formation a couple years ago. But I found in my own process of trying to get skilled in this field, there was a lot of bushwhacking, right, as I call it, like just a lot of having to like break down, you know, make my own path. And it was challenging. First it was the BCIA certification, and then it was, learning the modalities, but under a supervisor who, wasn't, he knew enough, but didn't know a great deal himself. And so it was a lot of sort of like teaching myself, which I think is what a lot of folks end up doing in this field, but also trying to figure out how to advance and how to talk about it and how to explain it to patients. And I mean, all of it was really novel and all of it was really avant-garde. And so the impetus of the school was to help other people from that same bushwhacking experience, right? So here it is. These are the certifications. These are, this is the content you need to understand in order to pass the test. But then beyond that, one of the things that I found is the more you know, the more you know you don't know. And the brain is the most complex organism in the known universe, and the stuff that comes out of the brain is the most complex noise in the known universe, according to physics. And so here we are, trying to figure out, heads from tails, how our patients are experiencing their symptomology based upon this data that we have, which is fascinating and exciting. And you have to be something of a futurist to really get into it. But then we're very limited in our knowledge, and there wasn't a wellspring of information. And so by piecing together and patching together and learning from this person and learning from that person and unlearning a little bit and failing and trial and error, and right, sort of I found myself at this particular point, which is just one point in time, where I'm still realizing all that I don't know, of course. But the point of the school, one of the points at least, was to synthesize all of the information that I gleaned over the course of time, particularly about EEG and the psychodynamics of EEG and the profiling of different disorders via EEG, and the use of advanced computational neuroanalytic techniques, and how can we understand this human experience through this set of data, right? So it's the bridge between the psychological and the physiological. And I found that was, not really well documented, and very hard to put together. So I think a lot of folks in this field suffer from the imposter syndrome, right? Which is sort of like everybody else really knows what they're doing and I really don't. And it must be because I'm doing my neurofeedback wrong, or I don't know enough about the brain, that my clients aren't getting better. And it could be a whole host of things, but rarely is it, rarely is it that the clinician is really just kind of checked out. They don't know what they're up to. There can be so many other things that confound the process.
So just maybe following on from that, the people that you've been working with in the School of Neurotherapy, where are they? What kinds of organizations are they working with, and whereabouts in the world?
Clinicians, you mean? People who are the customers to the School of Neurotherapy? Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, it's a good question. I mean, so the hope for the school is that it's platform agnostic. So it doesn't point to any particular software or hardware. It doesn't say this is the database that you need to use. This is the software. This is the hardware. This is the neurofeedback. It's really, especially in 2023, my hope is that this is just sort of a home base for a lot of different modalities, so that whoever you are, you can go to the school and you can find out where this training is or that training is. You can learn about this thing or that thing. You can learn from this expert or that expert. That's my hope. But people come from all different places. I mean, we have clinicians of all walks, of all ilks, but most people are neurotherapy practitioners, right?
Right.
That is the commonality. That's the thread that people share. But some people are new, never looked at EEG in their life, and they're diving into the deep end, which is how so many of us jump in anyway. Some people are really seasoned, and they've been at it for a long time, and they really want to learn stimulation. And we have a lot of resources on neurostimulation because it's the modality that I'm most adherent to, as is my husband. So we're chock-a-block full of that. Now I'm looking to get other neurofeedback modalities woven in to the mix.
Mm-hmm. Can you give a bit of an idea what kinds of professions people come from, that you're noticing before they take neurotherapy up?
Most of the folks who find their way into neurotherapy start out as mental health care practitioners. I would say that's 80%, right? This is marriage and family therapists, licensed professional counselors, social workers, psychologists. And then I think second to that, you would have like your chiropractors, your medical doctors, your naturopathic doctors, some of these other licenses. But I think most people come from a human perspective first.
That's an interesting comment. They come from a human perspective first, and then they have to embrace quite a lot of technology. How do you find that works for people, embracing working with some fairly high-end technology?
There are different demographics that have different competencies, so in our field, as you probably know, there's people who are in their 90s who are like Merlin Hurd, still rocking it, and then there are people in their 20s who are just coming in, and so there's an array of competencies. I think software is becoming more and more intuitive, but it's one of the things that's challenging about this field. Obviously, I mean, if anybody's working with feedback, you know that you have to greet the client, be the clinician, make them feel safe and at home and have rapport, and at the same time be, wiring them up and, setting thresholds and whatever else it might be, with grace and with ease and without getting flustered, right?
Yeah.
It's a great education in keeping your calm.
It is. It is. That's right. Yeah. And it's good to acknowledge that anyone who wants to get into this field, there's another learning curve to climb.
Yeah, there absolutely is. There absolutely is. So, I mean, I think most clinicians kind of assemble their amalgam of modalities, right? Sort of what is it that you like that appeals to you? Some folks do ILF, lens, and neurofield. Some people do HEG, brain masters, avatar, and Z-score, Loretta Z-score. So there's so many different modalities, each of which have their strengths and their weaknesses. Some have more strengths than weaknesses, and some vice versa. So that's an education as well, like just having to bushwhack your way through what's my flavor, what appeals to me, what's effective for me. I know folks who love Loretta Z-score neurofeedback, and I could never get a good result out of it with my clientele.
Just in terms of other therapies like other psychotherapies or other body-based therapies, like, for example, EMDR? What are you noticing people are combining with working with technology?
It's a good question. I find that a lot of the folks that work with technology combine technology with technology. However, almost always, I'd say 90% of the time, maybe 80% of the time, psychotherapy is woven in, right? And that makes perfect sense. So many clinicians do talk therapy as well. I think hypnosis is a beautiful dovetail. It's one that I have a personal interest in. I think a lot of folks do EMDR as well. Body-based therapies, brain spotting is another trauma-based therapy. Other than that, there's all the psychotherapeutic modalities like ILF and psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral and so on and so forth. But those really fall under the umbrella of psychotherapy. So
okay. Okay. So maybe that this feeds quite well into a question about just how you see, in your own experience and the technology that we used for the application to trauma. And I think it's interesting, because when, you alluded to the spirituality of this right at the beginning with your own experience. And when we go into thinking about trauma, we start using words like healing rather than treatment.
Yeah. So what was the question then? How do
you see how do you see trauma being healed using the technology that you use, and how are you working with that in the school?
Yeah, it's so interesting because trauma is provocative, and a lot of people are drawn to it for that reason. But it really is like a spiritual assault, right, on the being, on the soul. And so, in that regard, it's not something that should be taken lightly. It's not something that should be not looked at with great care. And I think foremost, for me at least, looking at trauma with the lens of knowing that this is meaningful and valuable and powerful and purposeful, not in the assault. So that is to say, not to sugarcoat it or say, oh, this happened for a reason, but more sort of a reverence for the soul, a reverence for the godliness, or whatever you'd like to say, in the client, and humility as a practitioner, knowing that you are, it's an honorable position to be in, to work this material with somebody. So then, the applications for neuromodulation, which again is sort of my specialty, with clients, sort of what can we, with neuromodulation, it's really what can we give them that's going to help balance the system, alleviate the wounding, right? And then from a neurofeedback perspective, it would be what can this person create in their own body that will allow for this, amelioration of the wounding. And it's really dependent on the individual. In a very simple sense, right? Just to sort of, for example, working within the parasympathetic range, right? The rest and digest, the sort of the 0.14 to 0.4 hertz, a very slow, soothing, rocking range to stimulate a parasympathetic arousal, which most people can tolerate. Or working with, a theta range, but I personally prefer Schumann resonance, like a 7.83 hertz range, which is a resonant property of the earth. I find that to be very effective with certain anxiety profiles. So ultimately it's going to depend, how does that trauma make itself known in the light, right? i.e., you have someone that has a neurosis, but the neurosis is rooted in a deprivation of childhood, for instance, right? Some neglect, say, or right. So I think that's the art in what we're all doing, right? Is we're trying to understand why the person is showing what they're showing, given the set of circumstances that set it up in the first place.
So I think you're just by talking about it in this way, you're highlighting that the practitioner-client relationship is as important as any technology that's used.
Yes, I thank you for, I think you're right. I think that the person behind the machine is really important. And it's interesting because there's some academic studies that have shown up where, I think how could you just learn a modality, a neurofeedback modality, and like go, here's 20 people with anxiety, give them that and go. It feels kind of rough and ready. And recently, we had a conference here in Santa Barbara for the School of Neurotherapy, and there was a very high-level researcher who essentially pioneered EEG lab. His name is Arnaud Delorme, and he was speaking at our conference. And he said, I just recently did a study with 12 individuals on neurofeedback and sham neurofeedback. And he said, I have so much respect for you guys for doing what you do. It was so complicated. And this is a man who like invents AI, computational brain interface equipment and software. And so it's kind of a tip of the hat to us for what we do, because it is the balancing of the human via this sort of, quantitative translation.
Yeah. Very interesting. You said that this is futuristic, right from the start. So how do you see your own future, the School of Neurotherapy, and the future of this technology? That's a huge lot of questions there.
A lot of questions about
that. Maybe some thoughts on that.
I feel like we as a field we're at the very beginning. So it's humbling, right? That word is such an important word. And so we're just starting to get our sea legs. I mean, neurofeedback has been around since, 1959 was when Joe Kamiya and the University of Chicago did the alpha feedback thing, and the kid, could predict his own alpha state with the bell. But, the field sort of began in like the 70s with the biofeedback. And so we're still new-ish. I mean, granted, that's 50 years. But again, we're working with the most complex noise in the known universe. We're just starting to really understand what we're doing, I think. So I actually see sort of this 90-degree upward trajectory. And I've said since I've been in this field, like, we're at the crest of the wave. But I think that the wave is going to get so much bigger than we even think, as allopathic medicine, Hippocratic medicine, Western medicinal practices of cutting into people and giving people drugs. And not that there's necessarily anything wrong with those modalities. They have their place, but they are also semi-barbaric, right? And so what we're doing is we're teaching the system to align itself. We're endowing the system with a path to use its own wisdom to heal itself. I think that as the human race evolves, I think we're going to get even more and more precise in our ability both to analyze, but then to address, right, whatever the problem is. But it will be a psychosocial, spiritual, physiological thing. It won't just be, body-oriented, whatever organ that might address,
Yeah. Could you, if you had a vision for where you think these kinds of treatments and technologies would be used, just imagine, this is a bit of a blue skies imagination. Like, would it be in schools? Would it be in general medical practices? Two things that come to mind. Where can you imagine people sitting in front of, doing neurotherapies?
Yeah, I think that this is actually going to become a lot more mainstream than any of us expect. I don't think it's going to be simply clinics or, you go to this room to do it. I actually think that the quantified self is going to be an interface that is part of the human experience, right? I mean, if you look at the works by Michio Kaku, for instance, he says it's we're going to have wallpaper that we can walk up to, and a physician will show up, and we can have a conversation, or a toilet that you urinate into, and it will analyze the content of minerals in your urine and tell you what you should eat. And so, right, like, that's why I say I think that we're actually pioneers in this process, and I feel like it's going to be woven into everyday experience as we all seek to become more peak performance, more optimized versions of ourselves, right? There's going to be a obvious, I believe, and strong corollary between emotions and physiological goings on. We'll see that tie really quickly, which is going to encourage people to be more conscious, quote unquote. I don't want to say spiritually minded, because people get that confused with religion, but recognizing the self as more of a spiritual being as opposed to a bag of bones, So in the intro, I hope that the school, I trust it will do whatever it's meant to do. I just want it really to facilitate this field. I don't see it as the field. I see it as sort of a channel through which this field is more accessible for folks. That's me.
Great. Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add at this point?
I suppose, because your clientele is mostly, because the folks who are at the ANSA conference are mostly Australasian. It's that if folks are interested in getting involved, learning from the school, quote unquote, of neurotherapy, we are going to be doing case studies. Myself and my husband, who's Nick Dogers, we do case studies and ERP studies. We're starting again in 2023 for your half of the world, which for us is about 4 p.m. And for you is whatever time it is there. So get engaged with that process, because I'd like to think, that we're fairly bleeding edge when it comes to computational neuroanalysis and dependent components analysis, right? Like, really understanding the physiological stuff that's making the person experience what they're experiencing. So if people want to tune into that, my goal, what I'm hoping happens with the school, and what I've seen happen with people who are stepping in to learn through this platform, is a very quick ascension to a level of clinical prowess that took me a long time to get to, because it's a synthesization of every misstep and every pro step that we've made as a field, and so it's a quick way to get spun up as a clinician. So it's not a bad way to go.
Okay, great. Actually, maybe one last question would be: is there an anecdote that comes to mind from somebody who's done training with you, that's come back to you and told you about some of the work that they've done?
I want to make sure I'm giving honor to all of the different modalities. I can say that folks who've gotten involved with stimulation modalities often feel quite beholden to it because it's fast. If there was one word I could attach to different forms of neuromodulation with stimulation involved, is that people notice improvements quickly and it's very fast. But the other piece is that I've noticed folks who have their heads screwed on, right, who are dedicated and disciplined learners, they can learn so much about EEG and analysis in a year. They can really be top of the line in a year's time with dedication, which I find really exciting and admirable and totally doable, right? So some good news.
Right. So a steep learning curve, but very achievable if you set your mind to it.
100%. Well said. Yeah.